Viking Sagas, Norse exploration and lore. Where the sea begins. It is late, the kind of late where the world feels quieter than it has any right to be. The fire has burned low, the wind outside hums like it has something to say but no urgency to say it, and somewhere far north, waves are striking a rocky shore with slow, patient rhythm. If you listen closely, you might imagine a longship cutting through dark water, its sail breathing in the cold air, its crew half awake, half dreaming, moving toward a horizon they cannot yet see. This is where Viking history really begins. Not with a raid, not with fire or screaming monks or dramatic last stands. It begins with geography. Cold, sparse, unforgiving. The kind of place that quietly encourages people to leave. Scandinavia in the early medieval period was not a gentle homeland. Norway's coastline stretched like a broken spine, jagged with fjords, cliffs, and narrow strips of farmland that stubbornly clung to life between stone and sea. Sweden's interior was thick with forests and lakes, beautiful in the way something is beautiful when it does not care whether you survive it. Denmark, flatter and more forgiving, sat like a hinge between worlds, looking south toward Europe and north toward colder ambition. Life here moved slowly, but it was never simple. Winters were long, food was seasonal, survival depended on cooperation, memory, and a quiet understanding that nature always had the final word. The sea was not an enemy exactly, but it was not a friend either. It was a road, a dangerous one, the only one that really mattered. And so people watched it, listened to it, learned it. Long before the word Viking meant anything terrifying to anyone outside Scandinavia, it simply described an activity. To go Viking was to go outward, to leave home, to seek wealth, land, honor, or at the very least, a story worth telling when the snow closed the roads again. It was not a job title, it was a season of life. Sometimes a young man went once and came back wiser. Sometimes he did not come back at all. Sometimes, inconveniently, he came back rich. The society that produced these people was layered and quietly complex. At the top were chieftains, men who held power not because of crowns or divine right, but because people believed following them was a good idea. This belief could disappear quickly. Under them were free farmers, traders, craftsmen, and sailors. Most people lived here, tending land that barely tolerated them, raising families who learned early how thin the line was between comfort and hunger. At the bottom were thralls, enslaved people taken in war or inherited through debt, living lives that history mostly forgot to record. There were no castles yet, no grand capitals. Power lived in longhouses, in feasts, in gift-giving, in reputation. If you wanted loyalty, you fed people well. If you wanted loyalty to last, you gave them silver. If you wanted your name remembered, you made sure someone sang about you afterward. And singing mattered. The Vikings did not write history the way later cultures would. They remembered it. They shaped it into sagas, poems, and half-whispered stories told beside hearth fires. Memory was flexible. Facts bent. Heroes grew taller with every retelling. Villains became darker, often conveniently after they were dead. But within these stories lived truth of a different kind. Emotional truth. Cultural truth. The truth of how people wanted to understand themselves. Their gods were not distant, perfect beings. Odin was wise, yes, but also paranoid, constantly searching for knowledge, sacrificing pieces of himself for insight that never quite felt complete. Thor was strong, loud, and occasionally ridiculous, smashing giants and drinking oceans because of course he tried. Loki existed to remind everyone that chaos did not need permission. These gods argued, failed, laughed, and died. They were not moral instructors so much as exaggerated reflections of human nature, turned up just enough to make good stories. The universe itself was temporary, Ragnarok waited patiently in the future, promising an ending that no one could avoid, not even the gods. This shaped how people thought. If the world was going to end anyway, courage mattered more than survival. Honor mattered more than safety. It was not that Vikings wanted to die, it was that they understood death was non-negotiable, so they might as well do something memorable on the way there. And then there were the ships.
Quietly revolutionary, almost unfairly effective, Viking longships were masterpieces of practical engineering, light enough to be carried over land, strong enough to cross open oceans, shallow enough to slip up rivers where no ocean-going vessel had any business being. They were built with overlapping planks that flexed with waves instead of fighting them. They moved like living things, which probably made them feel unsettling when they appeared unannounced along foreign shores at dawn. These ships did not just carry warriors, they carried ideas, trade goods, stories, disease, opportunity, fear, curiosity. They carried the Vikings themselves into a wider world that was not ready to understand them, and often not interested in trying. By the late 8th century, Europe beyond Scandinavia was fractured. Kingdoms rose and fell with exhausting regularity. Monasteries held wealth, but not walls. Rivers served as highways, borders, and invitations. It was a landscape that almost seemed designed to reward people who arrived quickly, struck suddenly, and left before anyone could organize a response. And in 793, on the island of Lindisfarne, the rest of Europe learned that the sea could bring trouble. The raid itself was brief, violent, confusing. Monks who believed the end times had arrived wrote frantic accounts filled with shock and disbelief. How could God allow this? Why here? Why now? The attackers seemed less like men and more like a storm that had learned to hold axes. They came, they took what they wanted, and they were gone before anyone fully understood what had happened. From the Viking perspective, this was not the beginning of anything special. It was simply a successful expedition, one of many. But history rarely cares about intent, it cares about impact. And from that moment on, the Viking Age had a starting point, whether anyone involved asked for one or not. What followed was not a single wave of destruction, but centuries of movement. Raids turned into settlements, temporary camps became permanent towns, traders followed warriors, families followed traders. Vikings reached into Ireland, Britain, Francia, the Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, and eventually across the open Atlantic to places no European had seen in generations. They adapted quickly. They learned languages, married locally, converted when it was useful, resisted when it was not. They were not mindless destroyers, despite how often they are remembered that way. They were opportunists, pragmatists, people who understood that survival favored those willing to change without apologizing for it. And all the while, back home, the sagas grew. Stories of exploration, of men who sailed too far and found strange lands where grapes grew wild and the winters were kinder. Stories of blood feuds that lasted generations because forgiveness was complicated and memory was long. Stories of women who managed households, negotiated alliances, and occasionally told their husbands exactly how foolish they were being, which, to be fair, was often necessary. As the centuries passed, the Viking world would shift. Kings would rise, Christianity would spread, the old gods would fade into metaphor and memory. The age of raiding would end not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow absorption into the very cultures Vikings had once terrified. But for now, in this moment, the sea is still open, the horizon is still unknown, the stories are still being written, one voyage at a time, carried on salt wind and stubborn hope. So settle in, let the waves steady themselves. The ships are leaving soon, and the night is long. When you're ready, ask me to continue, and I'll move into the great voyages, the early raids turning into empires, and the slow unfolding of the Viking world.
keeping the same calm, cinematic, sleep-friendly rhythm all the way through to the final reflective ending. Rivers, raids, and the slow expansion of the north. After Lindisfarne, Europe did what it usually does when confronted with something new and frightening. It panicked, wrote angry letters to God, and then went back to arguing with itself. The Vikings, meanwhile, noticed something important. The coastlines were only the beginning. Once you understand a river, you understand a civilization. Rivers are promises. They say you can go farther without walking. They say trade and travel and opportunity, all wrapped in slow-moving water. The Vikings learned this quickly, perhaps instinctively, perhaps because they were already people of currents and tides. Either way, their ships slipped into river mouths and followed them inland like curious thoughts no one had bothered to guard against. The Seine led them straight into the heart of Francia. The Thames offered London before London really knew what it was yet. The Rhine whispered about markets, silver, and wine. Far to the east, the great river systems of what is now Russia carried Scandinavian traders through forests so vast and quiet they must have felt unreal. These men were not raiding monasteries now. They were navigating entire worlds. Raids became routine, not constant, but expected, seasonal, almost polite in their predictability. A coastal village would hear rumors in spring. Ships sighted, smoke on the horizon. People hid what they could, reinforced what little protection they had, and hoped the storm would pass them by. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. History rarely offers consistency. But something subtle was changing. Vikings began to overwinter. A dangerous choice, but a revealing one. Staying meant learning the land, the politics, the weak points. It also meant relationships, deals, alliances, occasionally marriages that made future raids feel awkwardly personal. In Ireland, what began as hit-and-run attacks slowly transformed into something resembling urban life. Towns like Dublin and Waterford grew from Viking camps into thriving trade centers. Silver moved through these places, slaves too. It is uncomfortable but unavoidable to say that the Viking economy depended heavily on human lives being treated as commodities. History does not get gentler when we ignore the parts that make us uncomfortable. In England, the situation grew more complicated. The great heathen army arrived in the mid-9th century, not as a raid but as an occupation. This was new, alarming. An entire coalition of Scandinavian forces moving with purpose, intent on land rather than loot. Kingdoms fell, others paid tribute. Some rulers fled. One, Alfred of Wessex, famously hid in marshes, regrouped, and eventually fought back. History remembers him kindly, mostly because he won. The Danelaw emerged not as a clean border, but as a messy reality. Norse law alongside Anglo-Saxon custom, Scandinavian place names stitched into English soil, words quietly exchanged, law codes negotiated. Violence did not disappear, but it learned to coexist with farming, trading, and raising children who grew up speaking languages their grandparents would not have recognized. Meanwhile, farther east, a different Viking story was unfolding. The Varangians, Swedish explorers and traders, moved along river routes toward the Black Sea and Byzantium. They traded furs, amber, and slaves for silk, silver, and stories of cities so large they sounded fictional. Constantinople, Miklagard, the great city, left deep impressions on men who came from wooden halls and icy shores. Some stayed. Some served as elite guards for emperors who trusted foreigners more than their own ambitious countrymen. It made sense in a cynical sort of way. These Eastern Vikings were less interested in raiding monasteries and more interested in logistics, trade networks, diplomacy, profit. Their legacy would be quieter, but no less significant. They helped shape early states in Eastern Europe. They connected distant worlds. They proved, yet again, that Vikings were rarely just one thing. Back in Scandinavia, all of this movement had consequences. Wealth flowed home. Silver hoards were buried in fields and forgotten, or never reclaimed by men who died far from where they had started. Power shifted.
Chieftains with successful overseas connections became kings in all but name. Old balances of loyalty strained under the weight of ambition. Religion, too, felt the pressure. Christianity arrived not as a sudden replacement, but as an option, a tool, a political language useful when dealing with powerful neighbors. Some converted sincerely, others pragmatically. A few hedged their bets, honoring Christ and Odin simultaneously, just in case. No one wanted to anger the wrong god by accident. The sagas from this period feel different. They grow longer, more complex, less focused on single heroic acts and more on families, feuds, and consequences that echo across generations. There is a sense that the world is expanding faster than anyone can fully understand, that choices made on one shore ripple outward in ways no one can control. And always there is the sea. It carries people away. It brings them back changed. It offers escape from poor harvests in rigid hierarchies. It also offers death with startling efficiency. Storms do not care about bravery. Rocks do not negotiate. Many voyages ended quietly, without witnesses, without songs, without graves. Yet still they sailed. Because staying put was its own kind of risk. Because stories mattered. Because a man who returned with silver in scars commanded respect in ways a man who never left could not. Because sometimes the horizon felt like a promise that was worth the danger. By the end of the 9th century, the Viking world was no longer a surprise to anyone. Fear had turned into wary familiarity. Negotiation replaced shock. Defenses improved. Fortifications rose. The age of easy plunder was slowly closing. But the age of exploration was not. The ships were about to sail farther than ever before, past the edge of maps, past the stories they already knew how to tell. And the night, as always, was still young.
West, into the quiet unknown. There comes a point in every expanding world where the maps stop pretending. The coastlines fade into suggestion, the familiar names disappear, and beyond the last known island, there is only water, sky, and the uncomfortable awareness that if you keep going, you are choosing uncertainty on purpose. For the Vikings, this moment arrived gradually, not as a grand decision, but as a series of small, stubborn steps westward. First, the Faroe Islands, lonely and windswept, rising out of the North Atlantic like an afterthought. Then Iceland, discovered more than once because apparently no one felt like writing it down properly the first time. Iceland was not welcoming. It was volcanic, cold, and dramatic in a way that suggested the land itself had unresolved feelings. But it was empty of people, which mattered far more than comfort. For Norse settlers escaping crowded fjords, political feuds, or inconvenient consequences back home, Iceland offered something rare: space. A place where your past followed you only if you brought it. The first settlers arrived in the late 9th century, carrying livestock, tools, families, and an impressive confidence that this would all work out somehow. They built farms along the coasts and valleys, learned which land would tolerate grazing and which would punish optimism without hesitation. The winters were harsh, the summers brief, but the independence was intoxicating. Iceland developed a society unlike anywhere else in medieval Europe. There was no king, no central authority. Power lived in law, reputation, and the annual gathering known as the Althing. Once a year, chieftains and farmers met in a rocky plain to argue, negotiate, settle disputes, and occasionally ruin each other's lives legally. It was democracy of a sort, loud, personal, relentlessly human. And this is where the sagas truly found their voice. Icelandic society remembered everything. Feuds stretched across decades. Insults were preserved like heirlooms. One careless sentence at a feast could echo for generations. The sagas recorded this not as tragedy, but as life. People acted, consequences followed.
sometimes unfairly, often predictably. The land itself seemed to watch without comment. But even Iceland was not the end, because beyond its western shores lay more ocean, and beyond that ocean, rumors. Greenland came next, settled by Eric the Red, a man whose talent for conflict was matched only by his talent for marketing. Exiled from Iceland for murder, he sailed west, found a massive icy landmass and named it Greenland. This was technically true in summer. It was also wildly optimistic. But it worked. People followed him. Greenland was harder, colder, more isolated. Farming was possible, but barely. Life clung to narrow coastal strips, while glaciers loomed nearby like quiet threats. Trade with Europe was rare and precious. Iron, timber, and luxury goods arrived infrequently. When ships failed to come, communities learned how thin the line between survival and disappearance really was. And yet, they stayed for generations. Then came Vinland. The sagas describe it as a place of abundance, wild grapes, timber in impossible quantities, gentle climates that must have felt like a miracle after Greenland's long winters. Leif Erikson is usually credited with reaching it around the year 1000, though the exact details shift depending on who is telling the story and how much wine they have had. Modern archaeology places Vinland somewhere in North America, with Lonsau Meadows in Newfoundland offering quiet, undeniable proof that Vikings reached the continent centuries before Columbus. The settlement was small, temporary, a toe dipped into a vast unknown. And that, perhaps, was the problem. Vinland was too far, too disconnected, too uncertain. Encounters with indigenous peoples were tense, cautious, sometimes violent. The sagas do not romanticize this. They describe misunderstanding, fear, and conflict with a bluntness that feels uncomfortably honest. This was not an empty land waiting to be claimed. It was already alive, already claimed, already complicated. So the Vikings left. Not in defeat, not in triumph, just in recognition. Some places are discovered before they can be held. Vinland returned to story, to memory, to possibility. It waited quietly while the world turned elsewhere. Back east, change was accelerating. Christianity tightened its hold on Scandinavia. Kings consolidated power. The old gods faded into poetry. Raiding became less profitable as defenses improved. Trade became safer, slower, more regulated. The Viking Age, as historians like to frame it, began to close. But the people did not disappear. They became Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, Icelanders. They carried forward habits of storytelling, exploration, and stubborn independence. Their sagas survived because they mattered, not as propaganda, but as reflection. Stories about choices, about consequences, about how people live when the world is big and the nights are long. And maybe that's why Viking history lingers so comfortably in the late hours. It's not just about conquest or adventure. It's about movement, about leaving and returning, about standing at the edge of something vast and deciding, quietly, to keep going. The western horizon fades now. The ships turn back east. The world they helped shape moves forward, carrying their stories with it, whether it remembers where they came from or not. The fire crackles lower, the sea settles, and the sagas at last begin to slow.
The long twilight of gods and kings. There is a moment in every era when the noise fades before the memory does. The sails are still raised, the halls still filled, the swords still hanging where they always have, but something underneath has shifted. The world feels heavier, more settled, less willing to be surprised. For the Vikings, that moment arrived quietly, spread across generations rather than marked by a single event. The raids did not stop overnight. The ships did not rot in their sheds all at once, but the reasons for leaving changed. The returns diminished, and the old stories began to sound like echoes rather than instructions. Kings emerged where chieftains once ruled. In Norway, Harald Fairhair is remembered as the first to unite the land under one crown, though the sagas politely admit this involved an impressive amount of violence and an equally impressive amount of selective memory. Unity came at a cost. Local autonomy faded. Old loyalties fractured. Many of the men who left for Iceland did so because they preferred volcanic uncertainty to royal taxation. Denmark and Sweden followed similar paths. Power centralized, law codes hardened, borders mattered more than they used to. The world was becoming organized in ways that made spontaneous raiding feel inconvenient, if not outright illegal, which historically speaking is how most adventurous ages come to an end. Christianity moved through Scandinavia not as a sudden wave, but as a steady tide. Missionaries arrived. Kings converted. Churches rose beside old sacred sites, often deliberately so. The new faith offered structure, literacy, and connections to powerful neighbors. It also offered forgiveness, which sat uneasily beside a culture built on honor and memory. Forgetting was not a Viking strength. Conversion stories in the sagas are rarely dramatic. People argue, they negotiate. Sometimes they accept baptism on one condition or another, such as keeping their land or not having to give up horse meat immediately. Gods, it turns out, can be replaced gradually if the social benefits are convincing enough. The old gods did not vanish. They retreated. They became metaphors, stories told with a smile or with nostalgia. Odin lingered in poetry, Thor in place names and swear words. Ragnarok became a myth rather than an expectation. The world no longer needed to end for people to feel meaning in their lives. Violence changed too. It became organized, regulated, less personal. Feuds still happened, but increasingly they were settled in courts rather than fields. This was progress, depending on who you asked. The sagas suggest many people missed the clarity of older solutions, where right and wrong were decided with fewer witnesses and more blood. By the 11th century, the Viking Age had ended by most definitions, not because Vikings were defeated, but because they had succeeded too well at becoming part of the world they once disrupted. Their descendants ruled kingdoms, traded legally, and wrote history instead of singing it. The longships became symbols rather than tools. And yet, the memory lingered. In Iceland, the sagas were written down, preserved by a culture that understood what it was losing. These stories were not heroic fantasies. They were cautionary, reflective, often tragic. They understood that strength without restraint leads to isolation, that honor can destroy families as efficiently as enemies, that the past is powerful but dangerous if mistaken for a blueprint. The Viking world did not collapse. It dissolved, it blended, it learned to live with borders and laws and quieter ambitions. The age of sudden arrival and sudden departure gave way to something slower, steadier, and perhaps less exciting, but more sustainable. History rarely ends with applause. It ends with paperwork. And so the fires burned lower. The ships stayed closer to shore. The stories shifted from what could be done to what had been done. A culture that once defined itself by movement learned gradually how to stay. The night deepens now. The gods have stepped back. The kings sit heavily on their thrones. And the sea, still patient, waits for the next people who will believe it has something new to offer.
What remains when the sea grows quiet? Long after the last longship stopped surprising anyone, long after the old gods learned to live inside metaphors and museum labels, the Viking world kept going. It just stopped announcing itself. This is the strange thing about endings in history. They rarely feel like endings to the people living through them.
The 11th and 12th centuries did not wake up one morning and decide the Viking Age was over. Farmers plowed their fields, traders weighed their silver, kings worried about taxes and rebellions, which, as it turns out, are timeless concerns. Life went on, quietly stepping over the line historians would later draw in ink. What remained was influence. Not the dramatic kind, but the stubborn, everyday kind that settles into language and law and habits people forget to question. English, for instance, carries the Viking past in plain sight. Words like sky, egg, knife, husband, and window all arrived with Norse speakers who settled, argued, married, and refused to leave. Place names across Britain still echo Scandinavian origins, endings like by and thorpe, marking farms and villages that once belonged to people whose stories were never written down, but whose presence never quite disappeared. Law followed a similar path. The idea that communities could govern themselves through assemblies, negotiation, and shared codes did not originate with the Vikings, but they practiced it loudly and often. The Althing still meets in Iceland today, quietly holding the title of one of the world's oldest surviving parliaments. It is less dramatic now, fewer axes, more paperwork, but the continuity matters. Exploration, too, carried forward. The Vikings did not invent curiosity, but they normalized it. They treated distance not as a barrier, but as a problem to be solved with wood, rope, and stubborn optimism. Later explorers would follow different stars, sail different ships, and claim different motivations, but the rhythm of leaving home in search of something undefined was already well practiced. And then there are the stories. The sagas survived because they refused to pretend people were better than they were. Heroes fail, families collapse under the weight of old grudges, violence solves problems until it creates new ones. Love appears, briefly, then vanishes under obligation or pride. These are not myths designed to comfort, they are stories designed to remember. In a world that increasingly preferred order, the sagas kept the mess. They preserved a time when choices felt sharper, consequences more immediate, and life more exposed to the elements. They remind us that history is not a march toward improvement. It is a conversation between what we want to be and what we actually manage. Perhaps that is why Viking history continues to resurface in modern imagination. Not because we want to raid monasteries or worship thunder gods, but because something in those stories recognizes the tension we still live with. The desire for freedom balanced against the need for belonging, the urge to leave weighed against the pull of home, the knowledge that the world is vast and that we are very small inside it. The Vikings understood this deeply. They built their lives around movement, knowing it could destroy them. They sang about gods who would die, knowing that meant something about themselves. They accepted endings as part of the structure of existence, not as failures to be avoided. And so, the sea, which once carried their ships into the unknown, becomes a symbol rather than a road. It still moves, still whispers, still reflects moonlight the same way it did 1,000 years ago. We are the ones who have changed. The fire burns low now, the voices fade. The sagas settle back into the quiet places where stories go when they are no longer being told, but are not yet forgotten. Somewhere, the horizon waits. And for tonight, that is enough.